We're now going to switch to something that's very interesting. We always talk about big data, but I'd like to invite Dean Ho, who's now going to talk about the case for small data and really give some insight from the industry, the health industry. So, Dean, over to you, please.
Thanks again for the kind invitation. So my name is Dean. I'm currently the director of the Institute for Digital Medicine, also known as WisDM, as well as the N1 Institute for Health, N1, as well as the head of the Department of Biomedical Engineering at NUS. And today I'm going to talk about how we are developing novel digital strategies in-house and how we are navigating the workflows of integrating what we're doing. Everything from designing novel drug regimens for cancer patients all the way to dynamically changing their dosing in clinic to enhance the efficacy of their care, and how we are building these digital platforms into workflows in clinical care with the objectives of reducing the cost of care and building more patient-centric health systems. And so I'm going to start things off by introducing everybody to, I think, the interdisciplinary nature of what drives the ability to integrate novel digital platforms into clinical practice. And I have the privilege of working with an amazing community of innovators that spans clinical. So we have an amazing team of oncologists, of neurologists and chemists, physiologists, electrical engineers, and beyond. But an interesting part of the WisDM Institute is our ethos, which is that technology alone cannot transform healthcare. And beyond the technology, we need a team, for example, from the business school that handles operations and analytics, healthcare economics, to ensure that the technologies that we develop are both sustainable as well as deployable, all the way to incentivizing. How do we behaviorally nudge users of our technologies and patients and clinicians to keep using the technologies that we develop? Again, technologies are only as effective as the patients and the clinicians that implement and use these technologies. And so it really is a diverse community that we bring together, spanning engineering, medicine, public health, public policy, business, and beyond. And so today, as I showcase some of the specific technologies that we're working on, I'll talk a little bit about the process of how we're bridging technology ideation all the way with deployment. So the outline for today, I'm going to start off by talking about some of the challenges that confront our field, which is how new therapies are developed. And then once they're developed, how do we deliver personalized care at scale? And then talking about how we operationalize many of these platforms towards specific use cases, everything ranging from transplant patients to cancer patients, how we're looking at the coronavirus, and then moving forward into digital therapeutics. And so if we think about the everyday challenges with developing new therapies and bringing them to market, one of the major challenges is cost, right? So if you look at this number here, about 2.6 billion average cost to bring a new therapeutic through approval into market. And that's a huge challenge. And the reasons behind this challenge are, for example, that we know that it takes a long time to develop therapies, and we know that the success rates are very low. And when we think about how therapies are actually taken to patients, a mainstay of treatment, everything from cancer to infectious diseases and beyond, is combination therapy, where we give multiple treatments to the patient. But when that is introduced, a key challenge is how we combine these drugs together and at which respective dose we need to give each drug to ensure that we are optimizing care. And this is an area where digital can help substantially beyond traditional methods. So I'm going to mention why digital is important. And that's because if even good drugs are given at the wrong dose, there can potentially be no efficacy. All right. So what I mean by that is if a patient comes in for care and they are given multiple drugs, and these drugs don't work at standard dosing for this patient, the perception is that the drugs are not efficacious. And so let's move the patient onto another line of care. Now, in the case of oncology, when patients run out of options, they have to move to hospice care or look for a clinical trial. The challenge is even when good drugs given at the wrong dose don't work, it doesn't mean that these drugs can't work, right? And what happens is when drugs are put together, there's this very dynamic and complex interaction that happens where if you don't get the dose right, drugs that could normally work will appear to not work. and we have to reacquire efficacy and capture more responders to this treatment, right? By improving how we handle data, how we acquire data, and balancing the need for whether it's more data or whether it's properly acquired data, we can actually use digital to find more efficacy for more patients. And so, giving an example here, when COVID emerged, many groups around the world started leveraging computation, digital, many technologies to search databases for potential therapies against the coronavirus. And a lot of promising drugs were identified, but many of these drugs ultimately did not work in the clinic. I'm not going to go over this complex workflow, but what I'm showing you here is that the process of bringing a drug from just an idea all the way into personalized cancer care is a long and treacherous road. And when we think about things like digital, artificial intelligence, by and large, most of that work is focused here, using data to find possible drugs or design possible drugs. But a very overlooked area of treatment is the process of how do you take therapies, combine them together effectively? How do we match people to the right therapies? And once we have these therapies, how do we dose these therapies to make sure that we're continuously optimizing this workflow of care? And so what I'm going to focus on today with these case studies is to talk about some of these aspects of therapy. How are we designing better use of treatments, right? How are we dosing them better and building this into practice? Now, again, my previous slide, even good drugs at the wrong dose may not work. And so what's happening is there's this perception that if a drug is optimally designed, no matter how suboptimally you use the drug in a combination, no matter how suboptimally you match this drug to the right patients, and no matter how suboptimally you dose this drug, it'll still work by and large for the most part. But that is not the case, right? When drugs are put together, there is a very complex interaction, and platforms like digital can help find these optimums, all right? And so when I talk about optimization and data and parameter spaces, what am I referring to? And so I'm gonna give an example here today. A common challenge that we face is clinicians and drug companies will come to us and ask, hey, you know, I've got these therapies I'm developing, and I need to know what's the best therapy possible given in combination? Is it 2 drugs? Is it 3 drugs? Or is it 4 drugs? And can we mine a bunch of data, millions of data points, to find out which is better, 2 drug, 3 drug, or 4 drug? And after millions of data points, maybe based on population data, it'll tell us that a 3 drug combination is the best, right? But I will note that the way things are done now, all these drugs are given at a very fixed intensity or a fixed dose. And so no matter how many data points I have, they are giving me a very limited scope of how these drugs interact and how they function. So we propose to try something different, right? Instead of a few drugs, let's try 12, right? Let's try 12 drugs and increase the pool of possible treatment options. But here's a challenge too. If you take 12 drugs, not a huge number of drugs, but you try each drug at 10 different doses, because as we know, dosing matters to find optimal efficacy. That is 1 trillion possible combinations, right? Not resolvable by conventional means, all right? And so let's get even more interesting. Let's pretend drug number 5 doesn't work on its own for whatever disease we're going after. Traditional methods will kick drug number 5 out. It doesn't work, right? Let's not think about it anymore. But the reality is we don't give up drug 5 because perhaps drug 5 alone is no good. But if you combine drug 5 with drug 8 or drug 11 at the right dose, maybe drug 5 will be essential to optimizing care. And so instead of thinking about large amounts of data, we actually take small amounts of data, but instead of just a couple combinations, we actually interrogate biology with this very curated set of permutations of combinations, different drugs put together at different dose permutations to cover this galaxy of possible permutations, but with a much smaller number of experiments from which we can actually find the best possible treatments, in some cases within a few days, right? Out of 1 trillion possible combinations. How do we do it? And so using a novel digital platform we developed known as Curate, we have shown that patients animals, cells, no matter what testing model we're using, right? Preclinical animal models, cell lines, patients, we respond in this very parabolic fashion. So what you're looking at here is a liver transplant patient. And we are using this approach to manage the dosing of their transplant immunosuppressant to prevent rejection of the organ. These are 10 HIV patients that we treated, where we were able to find much lower doses that were able to sustain the efficacy of their care while reducing the side effects that can often lead to organ failure, right? And the way these therapies are so efficacious now, it's actually organ failure that will cause patient mortality and not the HIV itself. So finding lower doses are essential. And so today I'm going to give a couple examples about how we're using these approaches in the clinic, right? How we operationalize it. So let's start with that transplant case, right? In transplant, the challenges right now are how do we manage immunosuppression? Because if we give too much immunosuppressant, the patients can have neurotoxicity, seizures and beyond. And if the immunosuppression is too low, the organ can be rejected. Right, so not long ago, we published a paper running a trial with UCLA where we were treating transplant patients. And here's an example of one patient. This patient, from week 1 to week 2 to week 3 to week 4, the dosing of their different drugs was being managed. And the data we're using is actually not a lot of data. It's the dosage of their drugs and then corresponding to the level of drug in the blood to make sure we're not getting it too high or too low. And you can see just over the course of week to week, how much a patient evolves over time. And so what we have to do is we have to evolve our dosing alongside this patient to make sure that we are capturing their optimum. Now, this workflow was interesting because we were interacting frequently with the clinicians, frequently with the nursing teams to ensure that the lines of communication were open so that we could dynamically modulate this care in a very sustained fashion. And we learned a lot in terms of the frequency of communication, all the way down to the terminology that we were using. And as we start thinking about electronic health records, we have to think about how do we automate the information transfer process, but without automating the dosing process, right? We still rely on our clinicians to have final sign off on the dosing. But this was our very first study, which allowed us to start formulating guidelines for how we build this process into clinical care. But to give you the ending of the trial, our treated patients were discharged on average of about a month earlier compared to standard of care. Now, in a US healthcare system, a month reduction in an ICU is substantial, right? It could be tens of thousands of dollars per day in some of these facilities. And not only are we thinking about saving cost of care, but we are getting immunosuppressed patients out of the hospital faster. Second example, digital oncology, right? How are we optimizing treatment for patients for cancer care? So in this particular case, we had a cancer patient who was on a trial with 2 therapies for advanced prostate cancer. And the patient considered quitting the trial because the toxicity was too high. And so after some quick data analysis with the clinicians, we actually reduced the dose by 50%. That actually increased efficacy for this patient. Right, this was surprising to the oncologist because typically cancer patients get very high dose, but in this case, we actually dropped the dose to increase efficacy, right? And the patient was able to achieve resume an active lifestyle and achieve a halt in disease progression. Another example we have here is COVID-19, right? We were tasked with developing novel combinations to make recommendations to clinicians on which combinations might be beneficial to patients and which combinations should be avoided. To get this study going, we teamed up with a very diverse community of engineers, of clinicians, of global health security and surveillance experts, healthcare economists, and beyond. And our conclusions from this study were that the rapid and economical evaluation and development of new drugs was going to become essential in the presence of an epidemic or a pandemic because of overstrained healthcare systems as well as industry operations. This study we actually started around November of 2019 in preparation in the future for a pandemic that we didn't think was going to be here just a few months later. But we started this study early and we actually worked on a different virus at the time. But then it was timely because we were able to rapidly adapt this platform known as Identify to quickly develop drug combinations for the clinical community. Importantly, this platform, I think, was appreciated by the clinical community and the workflows because this one actually does not use traditional modeling and prediction. We actually pair live experimentation with the virus with an optimization approach to come up with a ranked list of combinations that clinicians can query to determine, if they don't have a certain drug in their hospital, what's the next highest ranking combination they can give to a patient. If a patient has liver problems and they cannot take a certain drug, what other options are there for the clinician to be more actionable in terms of how these patients are treated? Not only that, drug companies were approaching us because they wanted guidance on how to best trial their therapy, determining whether they should do the drug on its own or whether they should pair it with other therapies. So this is actually now publicly available at the N1 website. So that the research community can go in and plug in different permutations to understand how efficacious they are. Now, here's an example of the interface. What you have here is the different therapies that we had tried. Now, remember, this is in April of 2020 when we ran this trial. We are about to complete another study with a completely different set of therapies that are locally available. So that they are more actionable in the event that broad distribution of actionable regimens is needed. And so what's next? As I mentioned earlier, the core ethos of WisDM is that technology alone cannot transform healthcare. And so with that ethos, we actually teamed up with a number of stakeholders in our community and actually developed a comic book that is at the junction of digital health, digital medicine, AI, with how it can be used to address infectious diseases. And we actually started developing this book about 2.5 years ago. And so it ended up being quite timely, available for free download at our website for anybody interested. The final part I'm going to talk about is operationalizing digital therapeutics. Digital therapeutics is an emerging form of treatment that is what we call medicine without the meds. It's medicine that does not use pills, but uses apps and software. This one represented a unique challenge because instead of, we often have the patient with us when we do dosing for oncology or infectious diseases, but we developed this platform to try and decentralize healthcare. So what we did here was to look at an open source game, and we brought in an animator who's formerly with Lucasfilm to help us reimagine this game as a multitasking training tool. And we wanted to use this for a variety of patient populations, from seniors to healthy subjects to patients who've had whole brain radiation therapy for brain cancer patients. So look at how we can monitor cognitive training and optimize cognitive training to address cognitive decline. Now, the challenges with digital therapy is that much like pill-based treatment, one-size-fits-all approaches will not be optimal. And so how do we achieve this digitally driven N of one, or single patient personalized digital therapy? And so what we have here is an example of a multitasking game where you have to take this dot here and keep it on the target. There's an audio command that you have to follow to change these numbers here, and then you have to monitor gauges. And so what this does is this allows us to remotely score and track user performance on this multitasking tool, right? So this is simultaneously a diagnostic and a therapeutic. And so what we did with this study was to show just how unique everybody is with this treatment, right? And so we have here are some patients that thrive under high intensity gaming, some patients that thrive one day at low intensity and then the next day at high intensity. And so what we do with our platform is we dynamically and remotely and automatically adjust the intensity of training so that we can optimize how each user is performing in time, right? So this is a longitudinal optimization. But again, when we start thinking about these tablet-based treatments that are done at home, that has certainly led to discussions with our own chief technology officers and our electronic health records and our database team to ensure that we can start to seamlessly integrate this in a secure fashion as well and deploy this in the community. Right, and so before I conclude, I just wanted to briefly discuss kind of the lessons learned during this process. And I think that one of the most important challenges identified early was, technology can be great, but if we absolutely cannot find a place for this in the clinical workflow, we will really be suboptimally impacting healthcare. And a lot of patients will miss out on a technology that could be quite beneficial. And so what we did was we started engaging the clinical community and the health IT community early, so that we can help we could find a common ground on what the technology can offer, but how the implementation may or may not change the standard routines of clinical care for these clinicians. Because ultimately, our goal is to help improve care, to reduce the cost of care, to make it more patient-centric. But we also need to ensure that we are assisting our clinical community, the doctors, the nurses, the pharmacists, allied health in general, on keeping their workflows streamlined and not making their lives harder, right? And so by doing that, I think we've started rapidly advancing towards opportunities here, towards personalized care, true N-of-1 healthcare. And everything I've shown you, we don't use any genetic data. We don't use any big data to do what we do. We use very small amounts of data, which for the clinical community has also been able to help them with acquiring this data in a very curated fashion to make sure we're getting the right data, not just a lot of data to optimize that care. Right. And so in conclusion, what I'll mention is that we know that we're all different from each other. Patients are very unique from one another, but importantly, we're all different from ourselves over time. And I think that digital medicine and these platforms are going to become essential to allowing the care to evolve alongside the patient during the course of treatment. Right. And so these case studies hopefully have shown you that digital medicine can indeed empower truly optimized therapy in the clinic and to make accessible and patient-centric N-of-1 medicine a reality. And so with that, I wanted to thank all the individuals that make this work possible. And I wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dean. That was absolutely insightful. For a person who's always been in telecommunications, it's a very unique perspective to peer into a very different industry. There's a lot of questions that's been raised by the participants. So let me just pick on a few of them. One of the questions is for good AI ML in clinical studies as well, especially on if you say use the COVID use cases. It's also, is there a risk of using just plain set of data to do modeling, and do you need more explainable AI ML models, or whatever? I think what the participants asking is there a prescriptive set of data you want to use, especially as you're talking about small data?
That is an absolutely wonderful question. And yes, I'll say that I don't actually think the data that we need to truly optimize regimen development exists until the study starts. And so then what do? If we have no data, but we know what we want to do? So what I mean by that is right now, let's take COVID per the question, let's use it as a good example. So when COVID emerged, say in January, the very first things that happened were the clinical community, we did not have any drugs that were developed for COVID. There were no vaccines. And so the first step is to take therapies that we know we can use that are safe for patients, that may have some analogous application towards COVID, and just start running clinical trials. And what happens is you're getting patients running into the hospital who some of them have been infected for 1 hour, and they're really sick. Some of them have been infected for a few days. Some have been infected for a week. And those who are infected for a week, it may not even be the virus that's hurting them now. It's inflammation. Patients who've been infected for an hour, somebody's newly infected, super serious. Someone is been infected for a few days, not that serious. So you've got this mixed group of patients coming in. And what happens then is the outcomes will be very varied, right, between the patients. But what happens though is when you have to start thinking about designing combination regimens, which is really what you have to do for COVID, you can't just take the data from single drugs and then kind of add them together and then say, I'm going to train a model. We need to understand how drugs interact with each other. And not only, drug 1 and drug 2, drug 2 and drug 3, drug 3 and drug 4, we actually need to stretch the dosing that we try as well, right? Because getting the dosing right can actually change the drugs you think you might need for this person or this population of people. And so we know what drugs we want to try, but if we don't have the data, what do we do? Right? So what you have to do is you actually have to acquire that data in a way that allows you to actually optimize. Right? So I'll give you an example. I often get approached by drug developers that say, I've got 10 million data points, right? I've got 10 million data points for these 3 drugs. Find me the best. But my whole thing is these 3 drugs, the data points you have literally only give me this much insight in this corner of the optimization galaxy. I don't need 10 million data points. I just need data of these drugs acquired in this part of the realm that can allow me to optimize. And how do I do that? That's why we use the live virus assays to run these permutations the way we need them to be run. Instead of millions of data points, it's hundreds of data points. And within 2 weeks, we can derive globally optimal combinations to recommend to clinicians. And you know what? With just a few hundred data points, our results completely aligned with clinical outcomes in patients, right? So it's not about how much, it's about how it's acquired. That was a great question.
Thank you, Team. That is absolutely, I think you're spot on. I think your notion of where you introduce the concept of small data is absolutely relevant. The other question is, with the use of AI, does explainability become important for drug development? If yes, how does neural networks play out here, as it is more of a black box approach?
That's a great question. So actually, the methodology I just discussed was, so a lot of questions I get is available, where is the AI and what we're doing at this point? And we actually used neural nets to discover that if you take any complex system, right, and black box is correct. So take a cell line, or you take a patient even, and you give them treatment, we can correlate this treatment to the outcome, the efficacy of that treatment with this smooth surface. You may have seen a lot of these smooth curves that were developed. And so the neural nets helped train in terms of the experiments that were run to help kind of guide us towards this optimum. But at the time, we didn't know that, in fact, it was a second order. It was a quadratic relationship, because once you can confirm that it's quadratic, you don't even need AI anymore. Right. And so if you don't even need AI anymore, but the AI got you there, right? So this is a case where the AI, right, got us to the point where this second order relationship was developed. That is what transitioned us from the big data to the small data, right? And so when it comes to explainability, sure, it's important. I think we have to completely rethink the process of drug development because the way it's done now, it's very bottom up, right? Take the mechanism of action, put the drugs together, and I think that there's a huge gap between the community, the expectations of what the technology can do, and the expectations of what data is needed to drive the implementation of these platforms. So I think that there's still work to be done, but I think the results that we're showing, right, neural net driven correlations that are being discovered. And we're talking about taking years worth of development and finding optimum answers within weeks or even a few months, right? And so in the end, it doesn't even have to be that much of a black box. Once the optimization is done, we can actually then go backwards and then find out what drove this optimization that we observed, right? So you get the best of both worlds. We don't spend years studying the mechanism to find a better response. We find the optimal response first, driven by the neural nets, but now second order. And then once we hit the optimum, then we go back to find out the why, right? And then that's where I think the real excitement's going to be for drug development. It's going to start cutting costs by orders of magnitude.
I think that's fantastic. I think, marrying the transparency, but also reducing the sort of the cycle time, if we may.
Absolutely.
Is the best of both worlds. So
absolutely
fantastic. So I do want to thank you, Dean, for the time. I personally have learned a lot in this subject, so very insightful. Thank you very much.